So, perfect. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the 9th seminar in the Deakin Science Society Network Healthy Futures series. My name is Professor Jeff Craig, and I lead the Early Life Epigenetics Group within the Impact Institute of the School of Medicine at Deakin University. I also lead the Gene Equality Deakin University Research Network. My Gene Equality colleague, Associate Professor Eva Alisic, and I are organizers of the Healthy Futures seminar series. And Nia apologizes today for not being able to make it. A bit about the Science and Society Network next. It was formed in 2018 in recognition that scientists and humanities and social science researchers need to work together to meet the great challenges of this century. No single academic field can bring about the changes we need to see in the world. Bridging disciplinary divides is the key to finding new solutions to the problems we all face. The Science and Society Network supports early and mid-career researchers across the university who are embarking on groundbreaking interdisciplinary projects. Take a look at our website for some examples. I'd like to begin by acknowledging and paying my respects to the traditional custodians of the land in which each of us are on today. I would like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Let us pause to learn, acknowledge, and celebrate their ancient histories and cultures. I myself am a guest on Wadawurrung country, which covers a large area of land west and southwest of Melbourne, or NAM, that includes Deakin's two Deakin campuses, the waterfront in Geelong, or Geelong, and also at Warm Ponds. Next, a bit about our rundown on the structure of today's event. It'll be a bit similar to previous events, but also a bit different as well. I'll be introducing the two speakers, Associate Professor Eva Alisic. Eva will present for around 20 minutes and she'll on her imaginary real estate agency project and some models for using art to communicate social science. And then she will be joined by Jonathan O'Donnell for a 35-minute discussion with Eva, and then we'll throw to the general audience for questions, and that will last about 30 minutes, and we aim to finish by around 12:30. So welcome everyone. I'll be chairing the discussion here on Zoom via YouTube, and my colleague Tyler King will be moderating the YouTube live chat. We're very keen to hear and answer all your questions. So you can either post questions in the YouTube chat, send us on Twitter at SSN Deakin, and make sure you use hashtags such as hashtag SSN Seminar and hashtag Healthy Futures. Or you can email to ssn-info@deakin.edu.au. Now to begin, I'd like to introduce both Eva and Jonathan at the beginning. So first of all, delighted to introduce Associate Professor Eva Alisic. I've known Eva a long time, and we've had some very interesting chats about interdisciplinary research, a whole lot of other things as well. Eva conducts research regarding how children, young people, and families deal with trauma and adversity. In addition, she has been involved in global science leadership programs and initiatives contributing to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. John helps people get funding for their research. To be specific, he helps people in the Faculty of Science at the University of Melbourne in Australia, and he said all opinions are his own. He's been doing that on and off since 1990s. Wow, with varying degrees of success, haven't we all? He loves his job, and he loves it so much that he's involved for a PhD. Wow, to look at crowdfunding for research. With Scene Chu, he runs the Research Whisperer blog and the @Research Whisperer Twitter stream, so I urge you all to check that out. All about doing research into academia. So let me first go to Eva, and she'll bring up her presentation.
Thanks so much, Jeff. All right. Well, while we're getting into this presentation, maybe if you want to share in the comments or tweets the land that you're on today, and if you have an art project in mind that has a connection with research, we'd be keen to see that as well. And I also want to start by acknowledging that I'm zooming in from the land of the Wurundjeri people, and would like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and take a moment to acknowledge that I am on unceded land, and we will get to that point a little bit as well in the presentation. The aim for today's presentation is, well, to hopefully provide some inspiration. I'll talk about, how I have gone about exploring the world of art as a researcher, and a few models of how to go about it. And then with Jonathan, we'll also talk a little bit about how to get those funded, and hopefully having a chat with you and with each other. One caveat at the start, because we are presenting this as researchers from a researcher's stance. If this talk was happening at an art school, then it would have been flipped, and also really want to recognize how much research artists do. So it's, in a way, it's of course arbitrary and artificial distinction between researchers on the one hand and artists on the other. Of course, there's a lot of overlap and comes together in so many different ways. So let's get started. I have been thinking about what are ways that we as researchers can go about bringing art more into our work, and then in particular for research engagement, research communication, and came up with three kind of formats. One where the researcher and an artist collaborate, one where a researcher is more of an instigator or a curator or maybe an advisor, and one where the researcher is actually the person producing the art. So in the spirit of nice abbreviations and play with words, the three C's: collaboration, curation, and creation. And I'll talk a little bit about my own explorations in all of that. So in terms of collaboration, so as Jeff already said, my research is focusing on trauma, on traumatic events that children are exposed to, and I'm in particular interested in how they cope with traumatic events, how they seek and get support from others around them. And one of the projects that I did was with the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne, where we took sound samples of children's daily lives after they got discharged from the hospital, after they've had a serious injury. So a child might come in after a car crash with a serious injury, be in the hospital for a while, and then get discharged to home. And we were really interested in what daily life looked like at home, and how much they would talk about it, what support they would get, what that would look like. And so what we did was we gave these children and their families, loaned them an iPod, and the children wore that iPod for 2 days in one of those little bags that you can use when you're running to keep your phone. So they would have one of those on their body for 2 days, and it would take snippets of sounds, 30-second snippets every 6 minutes, and give us a real sound sample of their daily life. And we then coded those snippets for whether they talked about the injury, who they talked with, what they talked about, like more broadly, whether there was any laughing or any crying, whether the television was on, transcribed and coded all of that, and then describe that obviously in our research papers, finding, for example, that on average families talked for about 45 minutes about the injury and related topics per day. Now, that is a very general description, and I felt that the papers didn't really do justice to how engaging and fascinating actually daily life was, and also the mundane aspects of having a chat about serious things related to feeling super tired after the injury, for example, and then the next thing is what's for dinner tonight, like the real, this real life. And so I started to look for a collaboration with artists, and eventually met two German artists, Miriam Ackermann and André Batetsky, and in particular Miriam to start to develop an art project. And this is what it eventually looked in the DEC Center. It has been installed in 3 galleries since, but this is the one in Melbourne. And it's set up of 18 panels with these small speakers that you can see, and they've used 5,000 of the snippets and coded them slightly differently to what we originally coded them, more with regard to whether it was inside or outside and high volume or low volume, kind of very crowded, busy or not, calm. And then through a program, the speakers would kind of randomly draw some of these snippets and play them, and also alternated with some silent moments. So it was a real flow in that sound installation, and it was really, from my perspective, super engaging. And you see people listening here to the panels because you needed to be close to a panel to hear what was happening. And because there are 30 seconds, you fall into a conversation or a situation, and it raises all these questions about what people are experiencing in that moment, and what is actually the context of the little snippet that you hear in that particular moment in time. So that was, for me, what kicked off a real interest in art for research communication. And since then, I've started and finished a diploma in visual arts, and I'm currently completing a graduate certificate, and have done a lot more exploration since. And that brings me to the second C, curation. And there's so many ways in which, as a researcher, you can be involved in art, and art that is touching the topics that you are researching. And so that might be being an advisor to an exhibition. It might be putting an exhibition together yourself, or it may be really being an initiator, an instigator, among many other possibilities, probably. So one that I wanted to show today is, because I just opened it between brackets last week, is this virtual exhibition that I opened, because I wanted to share some of the pieces that I had been making in the past year in the context of these studies. And so learned about this virtual platform that's called Kunstmatrix, where you can basically find a room and build your exhibition literally. So what you see here is one particular view on the room that I put together, and it's called Chance Encounters. It's all about social justice issues, from immigration detention to climate change, child abuse, and some more trauma in general. It sounds very dire, but it also has some humor in it, and also a few pieces about acts of kindness. So yeah, I would invite you to take a look. I think Tyler will put a link in the chat to it, and it's a great opportunity, actually, quite low profile, to present something in a different format. So I'm curious what you think of that. So that is on a small scale, if you want. On a very much more extensive scale, I wanted to share the example of Flesh After 50. I'm not sure whether anybody has been to this exhibition. It was last year in the Abbotsford Convent. And here, Professor Marta Hickey has been a real instigator of a big exhibition with multiple artists. And yeah, it was truly amazing. I found her motivation was to want to change the perception of older women based on her clinical and research experience in the field of obstetric gynecology, and she does research on topics like menopause, and wanted to change the perception and show, you know, all the various aspects of how women who are older rock. So I'll show you one example. Is they had Ponch Hawks, a photographer. They aimed to take 500 images, pictures, and interviews of women over 50, nude women, as you can see here. And these are amazing images and convey so much strength and feistiness, and there's so many words that you can give to it. And there is a catalog online, so Tyler might share the link to both the exhibition and the catalog. It's really worth looking through, because there were fabulous sculptures, videos, this series where they aim to interview and photograph 500 women. I think they got to 400 and something, a really impressive scale of participation of women and showing the variety of beauty in so many different ways of understanding the word of these women. So it was a wonderful exhibition. And here the researcher was instigator and also key advisor and leader in that sense. So very inspirational, and there are many more examples, of course. That for the second C of curation. And then creation, where the researcher might be the artist themselves. As promised, because the title said it, I wanted to talk a little bit about the imaginary animal real estate agency. So here you see an image of the actual version in Preston. There was a cafe owner who loved this piece and said, "Come and bring it to my windows." So I had this actual real estate agency advertisements on the windows, and I'll give you a close-up of two of them so you can get a sense of what they actually look like. So the basis of this piece was really that I wanted to touch on how bizarre it is that we sell someone else's land. And in this case, playing with real estate text, but then combining them with homes of animals. So a clear connection to the fact that we live on unceded land, and any real estate selling is bizarre. So that was one piece of what I wanted to touch on, even though there's humor used. The other piece was more around biodiversity and the fact that humans are pushing out animals in those in this city, and other concerns that there are also in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals with regard to maintaining biodiversity. So with trying to cover a topic based from my involvement in the Sustainable Development Goals, but then also with a humoristic take. And at some point I also did a performance as real estate agent, which was a lot of fun trying to sell these homes to people. As you see, I've been very successful. The one on the left has been sold. Easy, low maintenance escape. And one of the special features of that was polished concrete floors, as you can see, as well as a rooftop terrace. So highly recommended piece. But unfortunately, of course, that went very, very quickly. So if you're interested, feel free to get in touch, because there is some note of the market cooling down, but in our office, I must say, it's still very, very hot. Back to serious matters again. So I did make a website for it as well, and put all these ads in there, as well as some of the descriptions of the more serious underlying thought. And so here you can see there was the page actually on the sold polished concrete floors piece that talks about, hassle-free setting, which was advertised there is fabulous, but we are on unceded lands. And one way to help contribute to reconciliation is to pay the rent and link to that. I want to go back to this for a moment as well to show. So I did put in all of my pieces, I put those extra descriptions, but then I also had people who contributed their own real estate opportunities, and Jeff has been prolific as well. So in the bottom right corner there, you see the ideal for large lovebirds. That is a location that was scouted by Jeff. So thanks for that. All right, that was my run through of some of the experimentation that I've been going through so far. And I would like to invite Jonathan now to join me, and we can have a chat.
Perhaps we drop the slides for the moment, Eva.
Yeah, sure.
And look, as we go through this, I've got so many things I want to talk about, but as we go through this, if you've got things that you want to ask questions about or want to make comments about, please just drop them in the chat so we can talk about them there as well. I want to talk about a bunch of things. I want to talk about showing data that is effectively invisible and beautiful ways to do that. I want to talk about different ways of knowing, but also different ways of telling. I want to talk about research and passion and humour and kindness, because all of those were in what you were talking about before. But let's start. Where does this lead? Like, they are beautiful things in and of themselves, and that is an end in and of itself. Like, they don't need to lead anywhere. I'm absolutely open to that. But you've, in talking, you said that they have led places. So tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, that's a good question. So one of my motivations is really about bringing some of the data that we have to people in a way that is engaging. I feel like research papers are of course really good to communicate with colleagues, but I want to go way, way far beyond that. And what I would love is engage people in reflection and compassion. And so we have these really touching interviews, for example, that we've done, lots of quotes and stories that people have shared that I feel are really not enough, have not had enough attention by just us using them or, displaying them in a way in research papers, which, so I'm looking for ways maybe to pay homage to what our research participants have shared with us. And as often for me, I start with something small and it becomes this snowball.
Yes, it does. And okay, so let's just stay with ubiquity for a moment, which was the first exhibition that you showed, where you've got those beautiful, beautiful transparent screens with the very small speaker in them, and the screen is acting to kind of amplify the sound. And so you had to, I got to go to this show. You had to lean in, particularly if there are other people in the space, and kind of listen, which meant you engaged really well. I like, one of the things I like about that is it is an absolutely beautiful way, and credit to the artists and the designers who work with you, to present something that is invisible. And it's not just that it's sound, it's audio, because there's, you could have just had a big speaker, right? But data is invisible, and what data means is invisible. Yeah, I just loved that show for that reason. And like, do you end up with these things also influencing, for example, your teaching?
Yeah, and the teaching of others as well. So one of the results has been already. So I launched this little exhibition last week, and already several colleagues have said, I'm actually quite keen to include it in my teaching, because it helps students reflect in a different way, and gives them another starting point to think about similar issues. So, for example, one of my colleagues teaches a breadth subject called inequalities. Her name is Karen Block, and she has incorporated it there because this work does make you think about equity, equality, and the related themes. And so, it definitely does inform teaching, and that would be my hope, right?
Yeah. I think when we talk about teaching, we talk about different ways of learning, tactile and kind of people who want to read, and people who want to feel, and people who want to do, and that kind of thing. I'm not a teacher, so I'm probably mangling that.
Well, it actually does bring me, as a minor diversion, to think of one of my colleagues in the Netherlands, Anna Harris. She is focusing on data sensorialization.
Yeah.
So there are people who do data visualization, which I'm trying to do a little bit as well. I've got a colleague who does data sonification, so from the data to sound, which is like the inverse of what we've done with ubiquity, well, the underlying research. And she focuses on sensorialization, actually, more broadly, and also very tactile things. So.
Yeah, and there's some beautiful examples of, for example, mathematicians who have crocheted, multi-dimensional spaces and stuff like that to bring in a different way of knowing. And we talk when we talk about art, we do talk about a different way of knowing, but I think it's also what I've got from what you've displayed is a different way of telling, right? So you talked briefly, you mentioned briefly, yes, we wrote a paper about this data, and also with the Fur and Feathers Real Estate Agency, I just felt immediately you're getting your message across in a different way. You're engaging with people. And when we talked about research communication and SciComm in particular, it's about narrative, it's about who's listening and how they're listening. But I don't know how that's worked for you. Do you feel you're getting your message across with these things? Or is it, like sometimes it can feel like you're shouting into the void, right? What's been the response?
Yeah, I think I'm just going at it from all these different directions all the time. So I feel like, yes, maybe initially one exhibition or one paper doesn't reach big numbers, but it does reach people. And then even sometimes years down the track, you hear about something that it did that you didn't know about even. So it reaches people, colleagues, students, people more broadly in my network, and then slowly it starts to creep outside of my network. With the exhibition, I sent that to, I don't know, my mailing list is now 500 or something people that I sent it to, and then there are new ideas where people have had somebody who might be able to include it in a bachelor's course, for example. And then students might see it, and so it really is this snowball effect. So I try and do various things, and sometimes it works, if we can say it like that, and sometimes it doesn't. But it's also me learning things. So in that sense, it's been worth it. And I really see it as an iterative process.
Okay, so let's talk, because I am, my job is to help people get research funding. Let's talk about the funding. How did these projects get funded? What funding? How much does it cost to put on an exhibition? Those sorts of things. Let's talk about the practicalities.
Yeah. What I find is that you can really find anything and everything in that. Like it's a very big scale. So in a way, that start of ubiquity of the sound installation, that was actually quite a big piece. Like in 3 different galleries over time. Collaboration with sound artists, I would not have been able to come up with that myself. Really, that is, we talked briefly, I mentioned how much I want to make sure that it's clear that I value art as a practice that requires training and development and lots of thought and also research in various ways. So I really benefited from the collaboration, and vice versa, I think. So it was very fruitful. There we did get about, I need to think. I think the funding was maybe about 10,000 euros, quite substantial, which went to some of the materials, because those speakers, etc., cost money, and the computer that runs the program that actually makes it all happen. A little bit of communications money, I think. In some cases, gallery space had to be paid for, not in all. Opening costs for getting drinks and nibbles, things like that. So there was quite a substantial amount of money. And there was also a symposium involved at the very first one that was in Germany. So there were several pieces to it. But then a lot of these other things have been much more small scale. The individual pieces, for example, I've got one Photoshop piece in the exhibition about climate change, and also the real estate agency has been very minimal cost. That has basically been just, printing a few things and sticking them up on somebody's cafe window who was just very happy to have it. And the website, I do have another website for my research, so I already have that infrastructure. So doing it entirely from scratch would cost a little bit of money, but for me it was really minimal what I needed for that. And then, of course, if you talk about the exhibition that I showed that I so admire, Flesh After 50, there I imagine, I know that there are several partners involved there. It is a totally different scale of functioning, of course. So yeah, wide range, but there's definitely a lot of scope and opportunity at the very minimal cost part.
Okay, but yes, there is, but I want to talk about something that is more precious than money, and that is time. Because when people say, oh, it didn't cost much money, often that means I paid for it with my time. It's a different kind of cost. And time I always think of as opportunity costs. You're choosing to do this or you're choosing to do that. As far as I can see, you operate on a 56-hour day, where the rest of us operate on a 24-hour day, and you don't sleep at all or something. I don't know what your magic is, but let's talk about doing this as activities that take time. Some of them correlate with your research, which I know is passion driven, but some of them sit with other passions that sit outside your research. And I think that's important too. Where do you find the time, Eva?
Excellent question. I have really preferenced it in my, prioritized it. I have taken some leave to do some art studies that I felt were outside of the realm of research. I've also had fabulous support within my work environment to engage with these studies. So I've been super fortunate in that space. So I've been able to, stitch it together with, again, various building blocks. And it has definitely taken time. But also there, I often want to emphasize that there are ways to do it that are less time consuming. For example, in the science gallery that the University of Melbourne has, there was, and also in other exhibitions, but there was recently an exhibition called Mental, and there were several mental health researchers involved as advisors. So you don't get your hands on the stuff in that sense, but you are involved in that artistic creation and curation, bringing your expertise from the research. So while I have probably taken a more radical route in deciding, okay, I want to do some additional studies, because that's, of course, has been a major influence on the things that I've been making the last year, and want to take time for that, and really, I set myself the task of, within the assignments for those studies, I would bring my research every time and try and do something with it, force myself to work with it in a way, because I wanted that. But that helped me come up with initial ideas, solutions to that question that I told you about, wanting to pay homage to the participants in our research and their input.
Yeah. And can we just talk a bit about that, because that's come through in several different ways, around open, like you said, pay homage to the participants. You said opening up, new ways to understand the data. You've talked about getting messages across in humorous ways with fur and feathers, and the performance, the performative aspect is really strong there. Why is that important? Why is it important to open up this stuff in different ways? I mean, that's kind of central to what we're talking about here.
Important for who? Do you mean?
Well, why do you care so much about that? You've put a lot of effort into it. You've worked really hard on it.
Yeah.
Why is it important?
Two things, probably. One is I feel that things need to change in society, and there are various ways to try and hopefully stimulate more compassion and acts of kindness. And I think in some way I'm building towards that, and understanding of people who have, are having a tough time. And the other is I just really enjoy creative things and doing the variation, and it brings it's that initial sound installation of ubiquity. It was just so much fun to work together, to not be in a specific straitjacket of how things should be, go beyond it, and that leads to new ideas, and it's just super stimulating. So
good.
Definitely
good.
Motivation.
Can I give a couple of examples that fit with these models?
Do you want me to share the screen?
Yeah, please. And then we can just talk about how they contrast with yours, because I think it's useful to have multiple different ways. And I'm talking about funding here mostly. One of the things is about it's important to have different ways into this space. So Phil Simatsis is an artist. He's a sound artist. He works at RMIT. This is an image of a recording that he did in Antarctica, and I want to talk about that in a minute. But also, I'll put a link in the chat to designing sound for health and wellbeing. So this is an ARC funded project, and it is. I'm including this because it's important for researchers to know that they can engage with artists and have it funded right at the top. The ARC is and the National Health and Medical Research Council, they're the top in Australia in terms of funding agencies, and Australia Council for the Arts as well. And it's important to know that you can get funding from that. But Phil wasn't lead on that project, but he was one of the chief investigators. And that project was a collaboration with health researchers looking at sound in emergency departments. And can you modulate the sound to have a different health outcome? So this is your model one of researchers working with artists, right? But artists were CIs, chief investigators on the project, or partner investigators in HMRC terms. So it's everyone has a shared responsibility. Phil's own practice is kind of interesting, and it's interesting because it's got him on a stamp. So can we go to, this is Phil on a stamp, and I love the fact that you can be a researcher, you can be an artist, and you can be on a stamp. So Phil's been funded by the Antarctic division of the government. They have an arts fellowship where artists work in Antarctica, and he wanted to, when we think of Antarctica, we think of it as a silent space, and he wanted to record the sound in Antarctica. And when I talked to him about this, he said one of the things was Antarctica is really harsh on your equipment. He's dipping recording equipment into the water under the ice to hear the ice grating against one another. And he could only do it for a short amount of time before the whole thing just stopped working, right? So I love that as an example, of how you can do stuff and how it can expand stuff. Can we just go to the next one, please? We'll run through all three and then have a discussion. So this is Bede Morris. Bede Morris I worked with in Dinosaurs Roam the Earth when I worked with Bede. It must have been in the 1990s, late 80s. And his area is diseases in animals. He pioneered looking at diseases in large animals rather than in rats and mice, small animal models in Australia. And he brought together this exhibition, Images, Illusion and Reality, which was about the history of photography. And his message, and this is artist, this is researcher as curator, right? These are not his works. He's bringing this together. He's working with the French government to get it funded, and the Australian government. And this is about, the early photography was kind of interesting but useless. The images are fuzzy. It's not, you had to hugely long exposures, so you could only just photograph buildings, really, things that were still. And this exhibition went all the way through to, the sort of photographs that you're taking of distant nebulas and of tiny cells and of subatomic particles. And his message here was, well, this is about how we fund basic research. You know, when the state stepped in and said, yeah, we'll help you out with some funding for early people experimenting with photography. And when, you know, patrons also funded that. No one knew where it would lead, right? And it's led everywhere. And that's really important. So curating this and putting across messages, I think, has real power. And then the third one is the next slide I want to include. Okay, so Sarah Jane Pell. Sarah Jane Pell is an artist, and she's currently funded with Floyd Mueller. I think they're based at Monash. They are looking at designing materials for play in water, or for how do you play in water, and how does that work if you're working with electronic materials. Now, Sarah Jane's a deep sea diver. She's a trained astronaut. She works underwater, on water, and way above water. And one of the things I really like about her work is, and I think it's relevant here, she says every space project needs an artist. That's kind of her tagline, and it's why she got involved in working with space. In this instance, I kind of think we can say, well, the provocation is every project needs an artist, right? And I don't think that's absolutely true, but I think it's something worth talking about. So let's drop those away. We don't need to see the last one.
Do you?
Okay.
Yeah.
That's all right. It's a beautiful performance work. This is a work she did, imagining what it would be like to explore the dried up seabeds of Mars. Okay, let's drop that. Let's go back to discussing. I love all of those projects, and again, Floyd and Sarah Jane are funded by the ARC. It took them 3 goes to get, you know, their peers and the ARC to understand the value of what they were doing, but they're funded by the ARC, and I think that's terrific. So we've got an example of a researcher working with artists, or researchers and artists working together. So that kind of collaborative model in terms of sound in emergency departments. We've got Bede, who's curating an exhibition to put across a message that's about research. And we've got researcher as artist. We've got someone like Sarah Jane Pell, who's working in the academy, but also outside the academy. And I really want to just talk about how they are different from, in our last few minutes, we've got about 10 minutes left, how they're different from what you've done and how they're similar. So do you want to talk about, let's work through them model by model. So collaboration, researchers working with artists. You led that project in that you found some artists to work with. Is that a fair description? Yeah.
I really set out to meet artists, had a couple of conversations, and then eventually, met Miriam, and things went from there. Yeah. But then in the actual collaboration, I wouldn't say I led the project. It was a real equal collaboration where we brought in our various expertise.
Sure, absolutely. Once you step into that space, it's absolutely a collaborative space, but you're bringing the data and you're initiating the project. I don't know the history of the project around working in emergency departments to understand how sound, but it's absolutely the artists and the researchers creating, if you like, new knowledge together. Right. And so there's the point I want to get across is you can collaborate, but there's different ways to come at it. Sometimes you might have a researcher stepping forward, like you did. Sometimes you might have artists stepping forward and saying, hey, let's look at this from a different point of view. Sometimes it can just be, two mates having a cup of coffee and coming up with something that works, right?
And it's also the the moment in time in the research project, right? So in my case, we had established a project, collected most of the data. Well, with the emergency department project that you mentioned, that was very early on. That was the start of the project, was the artist being involved in it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's important because, you know, it doesn't always have to be the researcher stepping forward, right? Sometimes it's the researcher joining in, right?
Of course.
Researcher as curator, if you like, or as instigator, Flesh After 50 and Chance Encounters, your virtual kind of display space. My example there was Bede Morris, who was bringing together and who was getting funding from the French government, the Australian government. I mean, Bede was at the top of his game when he put that together. He'd been a professor forever, member of the Academy of Sciences, blah, 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 blah. He's got privilege, he's got power, he can step into that space with confidence. Can we talk about that, about how those things come about, how you, like, leading is hard?
Yeah. Before we step into that, the other thought I had with that example, how that differentiates, is that Bede wanted to get a message across about actually science and scholarly work, which is also, I mean, it's often a mix, but that seems to be very prominent in that particular exhibition.
Oh, yeah.
Privilege and how to make things happen. Is that what you wanted to chat about?
That's exactly what I want to talk about.
Yeah. So, I mean, the first thought I have is, who am I to say anything about that? I'm extremely privileged, and so have definitely had opportunities that I wouldn't have had if I hadn't had all that privilege. And of course, in the academy, the hierarchy is there, so it does make a difference if you, whatever title you have or haven't in front of your name. So yeah, I feel that there is maybe, I mean, something that I try to work with and understand while I'm doing things. One thing that I try to do is to support the groups of people that I have been involved with for my research, and many of these people have had incredible levels of disadvantage. And that is a process that I want to take very slowly, in the sense that I don't want to rush anything in that area. And so one example, big example there comes to mind, is that one of the projects I'm currently doing is on focusing on domestic homicide, and really the extreme end of domestic violence. And we have been interviewing young people and adults, caregivers, with experience, either lived experience as a child or caregiving experience. And through my work, which I started in the Netherlands, where I'm originally from, years back, over, I think it's now probably 10 years ago that we started that work in the Netherlands. And started writing about it, and eventually met somebody in Melbourne here. Her name's Catherine, who has lived experience. Her father killed her mother when she was a few months old, and connected with her. And in that same period of time, I connected with a fabulous cinematographer, Vincent Lamberti, and put the two of them in touch with each other, because Catherine felt ready to start sharing her story with other people, wanted to use her story and experience for public good. And that has been a very long journey, in the sense that there hopefully will be a documentary or a screening of some sort of her story. by Vincent and Lisa Albert, producer. And there, from the very start, we've worked really on worked is the wrong word. It's so hard to have the right words for all these things. But what I try and convey is that with Catherine, we've built a relationship and a friendship, and always been aware that there might be a point where she would decide that no, actually, I don't want to progress this. And Vincent and I have also had conversations that we wanted to feel not detached at all, but free enough to say, okay, if that's the case, then that is totally fine. There should be zero pressure on her to progress this. And we're years down the track, and actually a beautiful outcome has been that Vincent has very rich material interviewing Catherine, and we've been able to use a little bit of that for short videos where she talks about growing up, that we are using in reflective practice sessions for mental health and social practitioners and other education students, a broad range of professionals and professionals to be. And she has, she's staff now. She is an expert with lived experience who is actually interviewing people for our research. She's a core member of our team. And so this veers away a little bit from art, but it has been a very strong collaboration, and hopefully has had several art outcomes. One actually was a performance that we did, if you can call it a performance. We had a conversation, the two of us, for an audience in a more theatrical way, where I asked her questions and she asked me questions, and they were beautiful questions. I think the question she asked me was when I first felt love. And we didn't know of each other what the questions would be. Yeah. So anyway, there was some surprise element, but therefore also this, because we have this connection, this openness and ability to talk about something really in a humane way about the topic that is really tough to talk about, but give people an experience of that intimate conversation at that moment in the room. So there is now this entanglement of art and research in a way that I feel is leading somewhere, and I don't know what else might come out of that, but it has already had several outcomes.
I want to wrap this up so we can open up for questions, but one of the things I want to come back to there is just that idea of time, right? These things take, it's not just you need to devote a lot of time to it, but these things take time. Their genesis is slow, and we talk about research projects because that's, we're bound by funding and, starting and finishing. But mostly we're working on research programs, and artists work on these things across their lives, right? And so do researchers. And I think that's a really nice way that we come together. We work at different speeds, but we come together in these projects where we can do stuff together. All right, I think we want to open it up to questions now, don't we? Is that the plan?
Let's do that.
Great, thanks both of you. It was such a fascinating discussion. I've learned a lot and learned about the processes that Eva, you went through in your work with artists and your own artwork as well. And I love the slogan, "Every project needs an artist." And so my first question is, what's your advice for, I'd like this slogan, and we'll go into in a minute about the some more examples, etc., and how it can. But how can researchers start thinking about this? What would your advice be? I mean, one of the obvious things is I've seen people draw an image for the cover of a journal, for example, that they've been accepted in. But how, and that that means that there's a, in that situation, there's a scientist and an artist in the group. But are there any other ways that researchers could consider working with an artist on their research?
I'm happy to jump in, Jonathan, unless you want to go. Okay. So I think there's so many ways, and already there is so much happening. I'm thinking of visualize your thesis and various other variants that are, on the radar for students, and change that conversation of how you convey your research to others. So I think there are opportunities there to engage in that. In many universities, there is an art department, and it may be worth just going for a visit, seeing what is happening, having conversations. There are lots of interesting initiatives also internationally. There is, for example, a website which is called Med in Art, which is artists who work on topics that are closely linked to medicine in various ways. And just exploring those projects is fabulous. And then reaching out to people if you feel like there's a strong connection here. And looking at University of Melbourne, the Victorian College of the Arts has regular seminar series that are open to all, that are online, art forum sessions. And so all of these are great starting points without having to commit to any, big projects or enormous amount of time, but just to start making connections.
And I think the way that it doesn't happen is through an instrumental approach. I don't think people sit down and go, I need an artist for my project. I will go and find the artist, right? But if you imagine as a researcher, if you had an artist contact you and say, I'm really interested in what you're doing, it aligns with my art practice in this way, how great would that be, right? So then just flip it around. Find an artist whose art practice links with your research and contact them and say, hey, I'm a researcher working in this space. And I'm really interested in your art practice. And it's got to be genuine, right? You can't just make this up. Because you're going to find yourself having a coffee with someone. And if you don't like their art, it's a very painful coffee. But it's then, and if nothing comes out of it other than a beautiful exchange of emails where you say, I love what you're doing, and they say, thanks, I'm really interested in what you're doing, then that's worthwhile, right? If it leads to an interesting coffee, if it leads to somewhere, that's great. But it starts with that kind of thinking about, well, who is working in this space, and how could I do this? Or what do I want to do? What do I want to do that could allow me to express myself in a different way? And then, of course, from my point of view, after that, it's how can we get this funded? But that's my own personal point of view, right? Professional point of view.
I give a couple of examples how that's happened to me. One example that didn't come to fruition. I'm a twin researcher, and I was approached by a pair of twins who were also artists, who had this idea to put the twins' genetics and their epigenetics, what goes on top of genetics, to music. And I thought that was a brilliant idea, and we could supply all those kind of sequences, and just listening to the differences, the harmonies, etc., that would tell you something about the differences within those twins. So if there's any, I think it's something that we can do easier nowadays, and we've got more connections. So at the time we didn't, and it was they applied unsuccessfully for an arts grant to put that together. But I've also, I worked at the Murdoch Children's Research Institute, and we had a couple of art for science events where basically the artists came into the institute, talked to us about our projects, and they interpreted them in their own ways. And that was really fascinating. And one said, please send me the digital copy of your image. So it was all just ones and zeros, and they created an image, a linear image from that. And it's a totally different way of looking at things. And to me, it was just, I think it helps us as scientists look at things differently. I had the privilege to be inside a giant inflatable chromosome that Melbourne artist Peter Clancy produced. And it had some white noise in the chromosome, and I felt, you know, I'm Dr. Chromo on Twitter. It's my ultimate to be inside a chromosome. And basically, Peter was an artist in residence. She went around different research groups, and after discussions, made these different art pieces, and some of them still remain in the Murdoch Children's today. And I think so. The artist benefits, and I think the scientist benefits as well, through kind of expanding our really sometimes quite narrow ideas. And that's something that the Science and Society Network is promoting, this interdisciplinary collaboration. Another example is I met the amazing Beck van Dijk, who's led the placenta project. She's knit her and I think a bunch of other amazing people from East Gippsland, I think, knitted a giant placenta. And they exhibited, it was on the stage of the Developmental Origins, the International Developmental Origins of Health and Disease exhibition in 2019. And this giant placenta dominated the stage. And it was just, you know, as a lot of the talks were about how placentas can reflect early life environment, this whole people could interact directly with this giant placenta. And also a recent example I've noticed but didn't actually go to the installation was Emma Burrows from the Florey interacted with Hiromi Tango to produce this wheel. Emma works with mice that, whose environment can be enhanced by running around a wheel and interacting with other things. And there's a human-sized wheel. If it's still around, I'd love to go on it next time I'm in Melbourne. But again, it's to me, it's this interaction that produces something kind of so unique, and something that that neither artist nor scientist might not come up with on their own.
Can I just on that question, Jeff, one more example, because I think you mentioned, on the stage at a conference, this giant knitted placenta. I think we should also think about exhibition spaces, like research providing exhibition spaces and providing an audience, right? So I went to I worked on a workshop that was based in Vietnam, and it was about rising sea levels and how they would affect coastal cities. So a whole bunch of researchers from different disciplines on that. And as part of that, the organisers had put aside an amount of money for an artist. And the artist, looking in the space, just went, all right, we will put a big drip tray in the centre of the space and just an enormous amount of ice on it. And, little penguins and little dolphins. But it dripped, right? And it dripped into a bucket. And it was the responsibility of people attending the workshop, of the researchers, to change the buckets over so that it wouldn't flood, right? And it was just a beautiful way to bring another sense and a way for people who may not have talked to one another to just, talk about, well, we've got to change the bucket, or, this penguin's going to fall off because that bit's going to melt now, that kind of stuff. So it creates new ways of just coming together.
And also urgency in that sense. Sure. It also made me think, related to that, of associations or research associations as opportunities, because conferences, when they happen, if they happen, in-person events are in a space, and they are a great opportunity to bring in art in one way or another. The Global Young Academy, which is an international association of young scientists, they have a subgroup that's really interested in art and art science collaborations, and they plan an exhibition linked to the next conference. which gives them time to come up with plans for it and seek out collaborations. Then also this opportunity for the whole audience there at the time to engage with it and go from there and develop new ideas.
So it also got me thinking from what you were saying about a different way of telling, is that typically a researcher would publish their paper in a journal, get read by a handful of other scientists somewhere. Occasionally they might write an article for the conversation to bring it out more to the public, but that's just one form of communication. So we only seem to use that one form. So do you think, what benefit do you think we could get from actually, getting out our publications in collaboration with artists and actually getting that research out there? Would it become more noticeable by the public?
Publications as an artworks or research?
Yes, if you were to, if you were
translating the underlying knowledge.
Yes, so you basically say it's like a 3-minute thesis. You would say, or even I think the amazing dance your thesis I've seen before as well. Is how can you? Because you might struggle as a scientist to say, how on earth do I communicate this? And maybe if you work with an artist, they'll say, oh, we can do this in one picture or something like that. And it's should we be doing this kind of thing more? Yeah,
absolutely. And I think different things appeal to different people. So the research paper works really well for a part of the audience, and the conversation piece works for another part of the audience, and something that's much more tactile or emotive might work again for a different group. So to me it comes across as all parts of engaging, and there is lots of opportunity. And what Jonathan said as well, like at some point it creates new knowledge by collaborating. So it is a cycle, of course.
You do need to keep in mind though that this is not art in service of research.
Yeah.
Right. And so one of the things that art does really well is take you into spaces where you are uncomfortable. And so there may be outcomes where the collaboration is fraught, even when you both are in the same discipline, right? You need to be prepared for a collaboration with a completely different discipline to go spaces that you may not necessarily be comfortable with. And that's okay, right? Because if there's something that the artist does that is, if you're trying to put across a message and your message is, food is good or whatever, I don't know, and the artist takes that into a space of spoiled food, then that's not necessarily the message you were trying to get across, but it's a really important outcome. So you've got to be comfortable with that idea of going beyond your own boundaries and your own way of seeing the problem and the way of seeing the solution and the way of understanding the world. Because I think that's really important. Otherwise, you just end up with, you may as well be hiring a designer, right?
Yeah, there is a big difference, isn't there?
To a brief, and that's the difference.
So it's an interpretation, really, I think, as you're saying, and I think that then the artist has that freedom, like the examples I gave and the examples you gave, that to interpret as they feel, and then I guess you can interact with them and learn from how they've interpreted it. As an example of a member of the public, because we often assume what the public want to hear. And the public will have different opinions, and for the artist to actually express some of those opinions, I think for us is good. It's good to hear and see them presented in that way.
The other thing to keep in mind is that artists suffer from the same problem as other researchers, in that no one sees their work and no one understands their work, right? So in gallery spaces, the amount of time that the public spend in front of any one artwork is vanishingly small, because mostly they're walking past, right? And occasionally they're stopping and looking. So it's measured in seconds. And that's just so sad. But art also sometimes has a very small audience, right? So you've got to keep that in mind as well, that you're collaborating with this artist, perhaps just to understand a new way of going into this idea, into this knowledge. And your publication may only be read and cited by a few people. And that artwork or that exhibition or that whatever may only attract a few people as well. That's okay. Right? Everyone suffers from the problem of where do we find our audience?
Yeah, and the question is also whether you need a big audience for all topics or all issues, right? Sometimes it's fine if it is small, and I often think even if a few individuals are touched and are reflecting because of what they've been seeing or experiencing, that can be absolutely worth it.
One place where I think researchers really could and should learn from artists is the government's kind of imperative for research impact and engagement. Artists have been thinking about engagement and impact for a long, long time in a really sophisticated way. You know, how do people engage with art? What impact does it have? How do we understand that impact? How do we measure it? And I think it's I think universities that have art schools in them are missing a real opportunity to understand that, because their art school has been thinking about this for literally hundreds of years as a discipline.
Yeah, and also there's of course so much variation in art, and I'm definitely not doing this justice, but social practice is often built around engagement between members of the audience and the artwork or the artist, and so just so many different ways. So if you are looking to engage, work with artists, of course it's worth thinking of, do I like the art, what Jonathan said? Do I feel like that the approach this artist has taken so far with their previous work might be something that works well with my particular idea I have in mind? And then, of course, I mean, does it gel? Do you have a good collaboration together?
Question from Emma Koval in the audience. She says, Eva, a practical question. Do you get credit for these projects as non-traditional research outputs in your school or faculty? And how do you balance your time on this? I mean, you covered that a little bit versus conventional research output. So, I probably take the offensive approach in the sense of, how do you say that, of taking the credit. So I present it as part of my work, and it has become part of my work. And I know that it's not always that easy, but I see it as so important, because I do see what it has led to with my initial small experiments. And so I do bring it in every time I talk about what I've been doing for my work, like performance reviews or on applications. I describe, where appropriate, I describe what I've been doing and how that has, what Jonathan says about impact, how that has translated into a change in teaching or interest from a group that I previously hadn't had contact with, or things like that. So yes, I do make it explicit, and I think it fits entirely in a scholarly approach. Yeah, that's a very good point. If it has that output of assisting your research or teaching, I think I mean, even your thinking, if it produced something, if it influenced the way you did a particular project, then I think it's a very valid justifiable use of time.
Yeah.
And we're talking about metrics, right? And metrics come into play in different ways. There's workload and workload discussions with your supervisor, and it's a difficult discussion to have, to say, I'm putting some of my time into this project, which is going to have an hard outcome, because your supervisor may not understand that. And there's, asking for forgiveness versus asking for permission, right?
Absolutely, and a supportive work environment. I'm blessed with people around me who are interested in this, with the boss who is supportive, with bosses of bosses who are interested and supportive. So that all helps.
Yeah. But there's also how you use your outputs to explain your work and where you're coming from and who you are. So there's Kate Smith-Miles, is a mathematician at Melbourne Uni. She's translated, or a statistician, she's translated some of her work on algorithms into artworks. They absolutely, in theory, count as countable in outputs for creative works, for Herdsey kind of thing. However, when she puts in her next ARC application, I doubt she's going to be listing those along with her, highly cited publications, because it's not the way she wants to present that work. She might, however, use it as an indication of research engagement with the public, of being able to step outside of her space and think about things in a different way. So if she's talking to a industry partner, she might say, I did this interesting thing, in part to show she's not just, looking at publications and whatever, and she's interested in other ways of engaging. So, metrics, the machine needs the metrics to run, and we hate that, but they also have a use in different ways. And you want to think about how you would use the outcomes from this project to explain your work and to explain who you are as a researcher.
Okay. I should also ask any audience members that are watching on YouTube to send in any questions they have, and in fact any examples of that you've been involved with or encountered. So we've got about 8 minutes left, so please send your messages through the chat. I'm interested in something, Eva, you said about, you kind of just dropped in, I found a couple of German artists. How do you do that? Bump into them, or how
literally?
Do you find them?
Yeah. So my strategy was just talking about this because I wanted to find people, and I didn't know where I would. And I had a few initial meetings, and we didn't have the same idea of where it would go, and so that didn't work. And I was just chatting with people in a cab, literally. To a conference location with Miriam, just talking about our work, and I told her about this, and I was looking for opportunities and people to connect with. And she said, "Well, by the way, I'm," and so we started our collaboration in the cab, in the taxi.
And do you also want to talk about, because I know you had difficulty finding exhibition space in Australia, like you were looking, so that's another thing. Can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, sure. A very similar approach, actually. Often part of my approach is strategic, and then part of it is just trying to put it out to the universe and hoping that something comes back. So in this case, I've been looking at exhibition space, and I'm a total newbie in that area. So just approached a number of friends and colleagues with that question, and that led to a certain number of, conversations and email addresses, and followed those up. And then the DAC Center, which is really focusing on understanding mental health through art, is on campus. And I think just knew of them and connected to them. I don't know exactly what the starting point was, but we met with the director and one of the main curators there, and discussed this project, and they were very supportive and saw an opportunity to fit it in within their schedule, because of course galleries often have a schedule that's well planned ahead, and if you want to do something relatively at short notice, that's difficult. But they were very flexible, and it could fit in. And in this case, it was possible to have all the other artwork on the wall still there, but use the space in between, which is what we did, to hang those panels. So it was a possibility to add it, which made it feasible at that time. Yeah. And of course, with galleries, sometimes you need to pay, sometimes that is not necessary. So it's just really worth exploring the various options.
So going back to the idea about mental health, this is going back about 15 years now. The Centre for Adolescent Health at the Murdoch Children's and the University of Melbourne had an art exhibition from the adolescents that stuck with me. Those images, you can see deeply into them. Some of them were quite disturbing, and it was such good art, but it was conveying a really strong personal message. How important is art as therapy? We don't have much time. We've only got 4 minutes left to discuss this, but how important is it as a way for people affected by a condition to convey how they feel about it?
I think the fact that such an exhibition was there and touched you says a lot. As an answer, the fact that there is something like the DEC Centre that is entirely dedicated to it, and also is a great advocate for artists who identify as having mental health condition. Art has been made through the centuries, clearly does something for us, and there is a whole domain of art therapy as a practice and a profession that people experience a lot of benefit from. I always find with these things that from an evidence-based perspective, if we think in the very narrow definitions of, randomized controlled trials and having a very clear effect that you're measuring, it's hard to capture. So I feel that we underestimate probably some of the benefit in the traditional medical model, where we have very clear outcome measures that are maybe too narrow in some way. So it's hard to. There is some evidence, but it's probably not as much as the subtlety, or there is a lot of subtlety to it, probably to that effect.
And there are many people, adults and children, who are non-verbal as well. And we talk about, we think about talk therapy and traditional ways of diagnosis, etc. But it seems to me the idea of, that's using quite a narrow part of our communication and enabling some people who either are non-verbal or communicate much better non-verbally to get those experiences and emotions out there. It seems a really worthy way of doing that one, but it doesn't seem to be explored that much in traditional therapies, does it?
Well, it's certainly something where we can learn so much. I do think there is more of a narrative and an awareness these days that we are differently abled and have different opportunities for communication, and how we do that. Always makes me think also of this fabulous restaurant I'm not sure, the first in Paris maybe, that was run by blind people and was entirely in the dark, and you had an experience of really focusing on the things you couldn't see but taste and feel and experience in a sensory way otherwise. And again, I feel like art can have such an important role in research, in therapy, and in our daily life, as it has. Like I'm not coming up with an invention.
That's good. I think one example I've seen is someone that has autism had a video in which they amplified the lights and the sounds, and they said, "This is what it's like." And I thought, yes, exactly. It conveys what the rest of us don't experience, and by that form of artwork, they're conveying what their senses feel different to everybody else. So we've hit 12:30, so that's the end. We could have gone for ages talking about art, science, and the inspiration. But thanks, both of you, for Eva and Jonathan, of being inspirational. You had a great rapport in your discussions, and I was kind of scribbling down all these notes and websites, and I think we'll put all the links that we've collected together, and tweet them out and put them on our website as well. There's a whole lot up there. Next time I'm in Melbourne, I'm going to go to some galleries and have a look at some art and science. So thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you later.
See you.